Taliban says we like Americans, but you kill our guys, we're going to kill yours. And we owe you a whole bunch of dead Americans in their book. It's an eye for an eye. It's part of their culture, virtually a religious belief dynamic, and this necessity, this moral obligation to come and kill Americans. And now we've given them a whole nation to plan in, to prepare and equip in. I think it was an act of great foolishness. It was a major failure from a partnership dynamic around the world. We've let down our partners, and we've given the message that America doesn't have the will to hang in there. It's a disaster in every way, and I think it represents this administration in retreat.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. Today I'm joined by Donald and Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman once again. Thank you so much for talking to us again. Just a quick intro, Dave Grossman is an American author and trainer who conducts seminars on the psychology of lethal force. The Colonel has authored many books on his work, like On Killing and On Combat. He's currently a retired Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army. Colonel, welcome to the show.
Hello, Petrus. Glad to be on board, and it's good to see you again, Donald. You guys have lined up some great areas to discuss today, and I'm looking forward to that. One of the things I always try to do up front, though, is when I was a kid, every city had a newspaper, maybe two. We had 3 networks, and maybe half a dozen true national magazines. And if you didn't get on them, there was no way to get your message out there. Today, we've broken that roadblock on the information highway, and we have the podcast revolution. And I just always try to take a minute. I've been on 60 Minutes in 2020, and they don't amount to anything. A 5-minute soundbite, and boom, you move on. This is really, in a way, a book. I mean, nobody looks at the newspaper from 1960, but people 100 years from now might very well be tapping into this podcast. And so I honor you who've taken your time and your energy to create the podcast. And I honor your listeners who are seeking deeper levels of information. I think, a lot of bad things happen in this world today, but I think the podcast revolution gives us cause for a little bit of hope today. So I'm looking forward to it.
There really is a transition to long-form discussions, which allow people to actually give, at least that's what we aim to do, and what I enjoy so much about watching podcasts by myself as well, is just there's really a place for people having a full discussion, not just the sound bites, having a full opinion, and giving people's perspectives over. So thank you so much for recognizing it. It's a great honor for us. And of course, on this, it would be absolutely reminiscent of us to not talk about, very topical things that are happening today, or rather, happened a couple of weeks ago, especially with regards to the Afghanistan withdrawal. There's so much, miscommunication, or sorry, let me rather say misinformation and confusion around it. So, I've seen articles, people say, okay, no, this is an obvious retreat because they're not going to be focusing on the theater and the, the growing tensions with China, whereas other people just simply said that the USA is in retreat in terms of its armed forces. What exactly is your opinion of this whole situation?
It's a great question. Kind of look at it from the global level first. In the 1960s, America had been in Europe as part of NATO for about 20 years. If we had left during the 1960s, the Russians would have owned Europe in a couple of weeks. In the 1970s, we've been in Korea for 20 years. If we had abandoned them, the North Koreans would have owned Korea in a couple of weeks. It's hard to wrap your mind around Korea, that recognizing their capital is within artillery range of the demilitarized zone. Jimmy Carter became president, and it's a good comparison to where we're at today. And Carter was going to pull us out of Korea. And General Singlaub, the last American general to resign in protest, resigned in protest over the issue, and Carter backed off and only took out 1 brigade of the division that's still there in Korea. It's kind of interesting. The only person we had to resign in protest over this one was a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel who they're trying to prosecute. But, not a single American general in the face of this debacle has stood up and said, no, not on my watch. I resign in protest. It's an interesting dynamic. When Jimmy Carter was president, he tried to pull us out of Korea and fortunately didn't. But when Jimmy Carter was president, he we lost Nicaragua to the communists, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, and we threw the Shah of Iran under the bus, and we gave away the Panama Canal. You know, how could one person have done so much harm in 4 years? Well, now we got Joe Biden, and the amount of harm that's being done is significant internally and externally. Curious to see how it plays out over time, but at the global level, there's no doubt that we have let down our NATO partners. We have let down our allies. We've established, you know, if we were there for another 20 years, would Afghanistan be a Korea? You know, would it be an East Germany? We don't know. And President Trump was trying to get out, but every time he said we're going to pull out, and the Taliban rose up, Trump just whacked them. It was a whack-a-mole. You know, it's all right, we're going to leave. And the Taliban rose up and bam, we whacked them every time. Trump, you know, for better or worse, Trump, to his credit, was not going to abandon our allies. He was not going to leave in a disaster. And but he wanted out. The amount of money being spent there that he didn't think was worth it. And a series of presidents, you know, President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize for pulling out of Afghanistan, and then he didn't do it. I mean, think about it. He came into office and he's going to come out of Afghanistan. The Nobel Peace Prize was given to him immediately. He's kind of top cover, and then he didn't pull out. And you ask yourself, why? And I think I know why, and it's just a guess, but I think they told President Obama, look, you're the boss, but we're reading their mail. And we know when we leave, they're going to follow us home. And now here we are, and they're going to follow us home. Everybody tells us the terrorist threat is the greatest it's been since 9/11. When the Russians left Afghanistan, the Russians were brutal. And the Russians left Afghanistan after a decade, and they followed them home immediately. The Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan immediately went to Chechnya, a heavily Islamic portion of Russia. Russia had lost their empire. They had lost parts of their nation. They've lost their Warsaw Pact partners, but they weren't going to lose Chechnya. They say, here's where we draw the line. We're not going to let go of Chechnya. And the Taliban has been giving them pure hell ever since. We got the Bestland school massacre and countless other things and horrible crimes that have been going on there. And there's a dynamic in play here where the ethnic group and the religious culture of Afghanistan is an eye for an eye. A lot of Afghanis say, you know, Taliban says we like Americans, but you kill our guys, we're going to kill yours. You know, and we owe you a whole bunch of dead Americans. In their book, it's an eye for an eye. It's part of their culture, virtually a religious belief dynamic. And this necessity, this moral obligation to come and kill Americans. And now we've given them a whole nation to plan in, to prepare and equip in. I think it was an act of great foolishness. It was a major failure from a partnership dynamic around the world. We've let down our partners, and we've given the message that America doesn't have the will to hang in there. It's a disaster in every way, and I think it represents this administration in retreat.
So,
yeah, what do you think, Tom?
Dave, I just want to share an interesting anecdote. I recently read Donald Rumsfeld's book, the late Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense. And he, in his book, he said that obviously he was one of the chief proponents of the invasion of Afghanistan, Afghanistan and Iraq. And he was confronted in South Korea by a journalist who told him, how dare you attack Iraq, right? You are oppressing that people. And Donald Rumsfeld replied, how dare you say that to me? It was the Americans who established South Korea. We saved you. How dare you tell that to me? But I just want to ask you, in terms of Afghanistan, do you think the situation would have been saved if they went after the bases in Pakistan, the bases from which the Taliban operated?
You know, the Taliban is really heavily interwoven into the community. It would have been hard to do. You know, one of the things that happened is we see this dynamic of the air power adherents saying they can win the war from the air. And there's an interesting history behind this. I presented a paper on it 20 years ago. The paper's been pulled back out again and dusted off and said, look, it still applies. And, the threat of distant punishment. During World War I, we had millions of psychiatric casualties, and they called it shell shock. And they thought it was because of the concussion. And today we would call it PTSD. But in World War One, they shattered their will with artillery barrages. And they thought if we bomb enemy cities, we will have millions of psychologically shattered, gibbering lunatics who will flee into the countryside, and we can defeat a nation from the air. And it was an Italian general who really led the way on this whole the concept that we can fight a war from the air. Well, when the Germans had the option to invade England, and had they just put a couple of thousand people on the coast, the story of World War II could have been different. But instead, they bought into this air power theory that we're going to bomb England into submission. And all they did was harden their will, harden their determination, without somebody on the ground psychologically reinforcing that dynamic, it falls apart. Well, then we bombed Germany and Japan mercilessly, month after month, and with horrendous loss of life. But the RAND study at the end of the war demonstrates that in Germany, we had no significant impact on the war production. It basically, all it did was harden their heart and instill their determination to fight to the bitter last. So now we've got the predators and the reapers, and we're whacking people with hellfire missiles. The fires of hell. We make a religious statement every time we whack them. We didn't even get it. They get it. So once again, we've got the air power adherents, that it used to be just a portion of the Air Force, the bomber mafia, they called it. But now we've got the Marine Corps has predators, the CIA has predators, the Air Force has predators, and it's a growth industry. We've greatly expanded the number of predator squadrons across America. And the upshot is that there's this reliance, if all you got in your toolbox is a screwdriver, right? Everything looks like a screw. And this determination there, if we dug through all the information, there's somebody who stood up and told the president, yeah, we're going to pull out the ground troops, but we'll support them from the air, and we'll continue to whack them, and we'll continue to nail them. And of course, we failed to do that. And the whole whack-a-mole thing on, pull the Taliban out and then attack their bases, it's just not that easy. For 20 years, we've been trying to hunt down the Taliban. We've been whacking them with predators, and they've gotten real good at hiding themselves. I don't think it would have been viable. But that's dynamic of pulling them out of their holes and said, okay, we're leaving, and then boom, killing them. It's doable. But just remember this culture that believes deep in their core that if you kill one of ours, we've got to kill one of yours. It's the tribal warfare that has been constant throughout that part of the world for millennia, for countless thousands of years. It doesn't get turned off in just a couple decades.
And sorry, go ahead. I just want to say it's just interesting to me that it's kind of repeated so many times in history after World War I, and this air doctrine repeats itself, especially when the Soviet Union also invaded Afghanistan. The points of time and where they had success is when they actually brought in their Hinds. I can't remember the specific name of the helicopters, but those big armored helicopters were the only times in which they felt they were actually making progress, because they took control of the cities, and the Taliban, or rather, sorry, it wasn't the Taliban at that point in time, but the militia just simply fled to the mountains. And again, an air doctrine took precedent. And I kind of see this so many times, and especially in geopolitics, which is something I really want to discuss. But just before that, I see this in sort of like arms races that happens between certain nations as diplomatic ties start to break down. So we've seen this currently in Ethiopia and Egypt, for example, with Ethiopia building the dam that's kind of, will perhaps restrict the flow from the Nile. There's kind of broken down economy, diplomatic ties there. And then both sides just simply build up militaries. We see the same thing in Morocco and Libya currently. This is kind of a doctrine where it's continuously trying to get, the next predator, trying to get the next weapon, trying to get the next detail. What exactly is the breaking point in this type of scenario? Or is it more just, military strong arming in terms of winning negotiations?
I think it's important to point out that with the Russians and the Hinds, their attack helicopters, it was the ground troops tied in with it. I think that the thing to understand about the air power adherence is that air power by itself does just simply seems to harden their will. You've got to have somebody on the ground who's occupying that territory. There has to be a human face to the aggression. The fact that you're going to face another human being. My book on killing, I talk about this need for this interpersonal human aggression, and yet that enormous resistance, the psychological trauma. The DSM, the Bible of psychiatrists, psychology, tells us that with PTSD, when the cause of your trauma is human in nature, the degree of trauma is usually more severe and long lasting. They talk about rape and torture, but bombs from 10,000 feet, we don't take them personally. Even a Hellfire missile from 10,000 feet, it's just not personal. And it hasn't got that ingredient that causes the psychological trauma. The Hind helicopters with infantry, the Hind was an amazing helicopter in many ways. It carries infantry and is an attack helicopter at the same time. You got a squad of infantry and a pretty powerful attack helicopter combination. But just we need to never lose track of that dynamic, that there has to be somebody on the ground. As far as the breaking point, it's a really great question. Where does this arms race break down? And it's one of the great studies in military history. And by the way, my book on combat came out in 2004, and earlier this week it was Amazon's #1 in military history. Now, not too bad for a book that came out, almost 2 decades ago. It's still being used intensely. But this whole question in military history, look at World War II. Was it inevitable? Could we have deterred them? We appeased them. Was that appeasement? Did it feed them? Could we have stopped it? It's almost the unanswerable what if question. We can look at every war. It comes down to personalities. It comes down to individuals and misperceptions so often that lead to war. So the great example, Ethiopia and Egypt, Egypt will kick their tail. It's not even a comparison. And I think Ethiopia knows that. Ethiopia is barely a nation state. They can't even keep Eritrea under control. And Egypt is a well-developed nation with a well-developed armed forces. But Ethiopia is an interesting historical dynamic. When Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia, the one African nation that was never colonized. And when the Italians attacked, Haile Selassie's op order on mobilizing the troops is used as a model operations order in the staff college. It's really kind of interesting. It's something good to look up someday on how he went about mobilizing the population and what he did with the women and the children and what ages, and it was just brilliant. So here Italy thought they'd just walk in and take over Ethiopia. It wasn't that easy. So there's always surprises out there and other dynamics going on. Ethiopia has never truly been conquered from without, although like I said, the communists pretty much owned it, along with Angola and Mozambique during that brief period of time. That they no more owned it than we owned Afghanistan. I think that's an interesting question. Now the dynamic.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating because there exactly is a situation where an economic and perhaps even an idealistic victory was won over Ethiopia in a case where it wasn't conquered militarily, but economically, and with all of these type of doctrines that came together, they basically were owned through economic pressures. And so in this case, there is cases where we see the arms race as a result of economic pressures and diplomacy breaking down. But in the other case, we actually see the economic and diplomacy pressures winning, and by perhaps playing it nicely and sort of getting them under a debt scenario.
We don't notice those because they're the ones that didn't go to war. Right. An interesting side effect on 20 years of war. In 1993, I got to go to the British Staff College as a young Army major. Now, the Army Staff College is in Leavenworth, Kansas, which is also where we put our big federal prison. When you say Leavenworth, you think prison. So instead of going to Leavenworth for a year, I got to go to England for a year, and that was a good deal. And we had representatives from 52 foreign nations. And just about any nation that had ever been a British colony had somebody there. And so we had people from Egypt, we had people from Sudan, we had Jordanians, we had an interesting assortment. And we were sitting down talking one day with a group of these individuals, and the Brits were not there. You know, it's a bunch of us colonials and talking to each other. And we said, you know, if you had to be colonized, and everybody did, with few exceptions, it was really a stroke of good luck to be colonized by the Brits. You know, look at the Portuguese colonies, the French colonies. Look how they've turned out. But the question turned to our Egyptian and Jordanian and other Arab friends there. Why has there never been an Arab democracy? And it was really an interesting question. And their answer was straightforward. Arabs won't vote. Arabs don't want a democracy. It's part of our culture. There will never be an Arab democracy. You've just got to respect our culture. And then Iraq, and millions of Iraqis with those purple fingers, the first Arab democracy. And suddenly that myth that there will never be an Arab democracy, that Arabs won't vote. And we see what was called the Arab Spring, you know, which didn't turn out quite as well as you might want it to. But we see that Arab Spring floating across that Arab world, and some places turned out better than others. But this breaking of myths, this unconscious assumption. So what are the unconscious assumptions going on in Ethiopia and Egypt, for example? You know, I think you in South Africa are much better tuned in to what's happening there and what their cultures and what their people might be thinking than we are. But truly, there are just hidden assumptions and hidden unknowns that we can never fully understand. But I think that it's one of the great questions. If we could just predict, and what are the things we could do to prevent war? And the truth is, we've gotten pretty good at that. We've really gotten pretty good at preventing war on a comparative basis, as opposed to previous centuries and decades. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, that there generally is a mentality, especially in, I want to say, especially people that were born after 1919, so after the fall of the Soviet Union, that really were an environment where people felt, you know, there really won't be any major conflicts. And I mean, it'll be terrible of me to say that, you know, Afghan war and the Iraqi invasion, all those things were not, you know, major conflicts. But I'm saying about a global world war, you know, a scale of something, the death and destruction, which we've last seen, you know, in stuff like South Korea and in obviously the Second World War and those type of details. There really is a mentality, especially in my generation and younger, where you just simply think this is impossible. Like it just won't happen again, this open all-out war and scenario. But I want to transition over to just a bit more of a question actually related to the Afghanistan withdrawal. A lot of the withdrawal came with people asking a lot of questions in terms of, okay, you know, why did they want to withdraw in the first place? Okay, well, one of the major reasons was the military budget that was being spent in Afghanistan. And, you know, these are a lot of good questions that people ask because, you know, this, of course, is taxpayer money that the people are putting forward through their taxes. So they want to know about this. But there's a lot of misunderstanding, at least in terms of, you know, what I've read about the military budget, which I would like to get your opinion on, especially if you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, that'd be great. So in my perspective, the military budget has been, in terms of what I've seen and what I've been interested in, what I watch YouTube videos about, is a lot also not only about, you know, the wars that are being fought, you know, all over the world by the US military and the positions that keep the peace, but also about development. So, you know, military technology development, the training and the funding of engineers, of projects, and also just simply employment. You know, I mean, government employment, military employment is a form of government employment. It keeps people out of poverty. It gives them a job. A large part of Guam, for example, is employed purely by the military budget. So maybe, you know, would you say that there's a complete misunderstanding in terms of what this massive military budget of the USA actually constitutes, and the fact that it's actually a lot of things besides just warfare? It's education, it's, you know, job creation, it's all of these, you know, development, training.
Yeah, manpower wise, the U.S. Armed Forces is less than 1% of our population. So from the perspective of, you know, keeping people employed, it's not so big a thing. Recruiting right now has nosedived. You know, during the Carter administration, the recruiting was in the pits. I was there during those years. I was a young sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division, and it's just hard to imagine how horrendous things got during the administration and how bad recruiting was and how hard it was. It's interesting to note that we fought 20 years of war without a draft. And 4 years into the war, There was nobody left who enlisted before the war and got stuck with the war. So for 15 years, we fought this war with 100% wartime volunteers. The last war America fought with 100% wartime volunteers was the American Revolution. Started in 1812, we always had people enlist before the war, got stuck with the war. If the Longros was had the draft. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but recruiting was great during the war. People were signing on to go to war, but it was such a tiny percentage of our population, and we could be so selective. And I've got a son with 9 combat tours. The loss of life was so small. And it just changed all the dynamics on how people view a war. You know, it was an easy war in some ways, but certainly an awful lot of money spent. Comparatively, you know, we as a nation, we are horribly in the red. We are in debt to our ears, and I don't see any answer, but in you know, decades down the road, to just simply welshing on our debt. So we're sorry, I'm going to pay that. You're done. And but if we look back, it was during the Nixon administration. Nixon made a big deal about the fact that for the first time, the U.S. government is spending more money on its own people than it's spending on defense. So it was right up until the late 1960s that the primary use of this huge American budget was defense. And we've spent proportionately less and less and less across the years. It's possible that China will take Taiwan. The current administration laid a foundation for it. It's entirely possible that we'll lose South Korea. It's entirely possible, like Jimmy Carter, we'll see just this cascading domino effect around the world. The cowardless, the feckless, useless Biden administration, whether or not we'll see Taiwan survive this fecklessness, this insanity of this stupidity of this government. As you can tell, I'm not a big fan of those guys. But Taiwan may very well pay the price for it. And what will that do? I think given a significant enough threat that we will see the American change the way they do business back to the majority of our budget going to defense. And that changes everything. If you look at the height of the Cold War, if you look at the 50s and the 60s, we were putting out a new generation of aircraft every couple of years. You know, the F-101, the F-102, the F-103, the F-111, we were just pumping out aircraft. Today, we're lucky to get a new aircraft out every 20 years, you know. And it's a matter of budget dynamics. So if we were pressed, you know, we won World War II, we spent our way out of World War II. You know, we just spent money. It was this vast well of wealth that really got us out of World War II. We didn't have superiority in tanks. We didn't really have superiority in troops. The only thing we had superiority in was money, and we threw a lot of money at the problem. I think another 9/11 style attack is coming, but I'll tell you something I've been telling to our veterans, and I think it's a value to NATO and everybody else has been in Afghanistan. It was very early in the war. The World Trade Center is still smoldering rubble. We're still estimating 4,000 dead from the 9/11 attacks. I'm training the first batch of Spec Ops headed off to Afghanistan. And a young Green Beret, a young Special Forces sergeant came up to me. And he said, "Colonel, we're going to Afghanistan and we're going to kick their ass." He said, "While we're there, you tell those cops you teach, don't let them come kill my kids while I'm over there. Don't you let those bastards come hurt my kids while we're over there." And I've been passing on that message for 20 years. Very early on, I was trained in Chicago Police Department. And a crusty old Chicago PD sergeant came up to me. He said, "Colonel, you tell those kids we got their six, we got their back, but we can't be everywhere. You tell them, hunt the bastards down over there. We'll do the best we can over here. And every day that we don't have another 9/11 is a victory. Every day there's not another 9/11 is a victory." And so they bought us 20 years of victory. Our law enforcement in America, we have the Posse Comitatus Act. The U.S. Armed Forces are not allowed to engage on American soil. We're the only nation on the planet that plays by that rule. Our military cannot act on American soil without specific congressional authority. Now, the exception is the Coast Guard and the National Guard. They ain't showed up no time soon. So we have given the mission to local law enforcement. Now, they have armed themselves, they've trained themselves, they've prepared themselves, but these are hard times in law enforcement right now. Recruiting is down, retention is down, manpower is down. We can barely cut people loose for training, let alone have somebody to do the job. But just 20 years, we kept them off our back. 20 years, there hasn't been another 9/11. It represents a significant victory. But I think those days are numbered.
But Dave, if we can bring it back to the defense budget question that Petrus asked, I think there was a moment in the 2012 debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, where Mitt Romney made the point that we are spending less money on tanks. I can't remember precisely what he was mentioning, but I believe it was like tanks and aircraft. And Barack Obama responded with, okay, but Mitt, we're also spending less money on bayonets and horses. We are spending less money on that because it's not as useful anymore. So is there an argument there to be made that we must spend our money more wisely, less on things that we don't really need, and that way we are saving money in terms of the defense budget?
I think without a doubt, that was Trump's motivation. The money being spent on Afghanistan, Trump was truly focused on the threat of China. And he truly considered that his number one external threat, with Russia kind of a distant second. And he was truly motivated to spend the money where it would do the most good. And spending money deployed in Afghanistan, and there's just this rat hole we were throwing money down. It's a legitimate response to spend our money wisely. But then we turn around and have another Iraq, another Afghanistan, and we have to turn around and fight a war with fighter jets when the enemy doesn't even have an air force, with vast amounts of money spent on it. But I think prioritizing the Chinese threat is legitimate. And I know that was Trump's objective. And but I just tell you that the capacity for America to arm and to truly mobilize hasn't really been seen since the 1950s. And the Cold War, the majority of our the majority of our tax dollars going into military. So there are, will the fall of Taiwan, will that mobilize us? Will the fall of South Korea, will that do it? Will the Chinese become more belligerent? It looks like they will. You could very well see, Jimmy Carter was a tragedy in American history, but we needed 4 years of Carter to get 8 years of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan prioritized military dollars, and he had the votes and he had the support to do it. Is there another Ronald Reagan in the background? Will he mobilize us? Will our nation become motivated? If we have a series of 9/11 attacks, if we lose Taiwan and South Korea, you could very well see us in a post-World War II, early Cold War dynamics, in which we stop paying money for the socialist state out there and start putting money into wealth. But there's just too many unknown factors out there right now to see where we're going to go. I think the potential is there in the next presidential election for another Reagan, but there's so many unknown factors. If China is foolish enough to take Taiwan, that by itself would be a mobilizing dynamic. If our enemy is foolish enough to give us multiple 9/11s, that could mobilize our nation in ways we haven't seen in a very long way. And all of those are hanging out there. We don't know what's going to happen, but they're worthy of consideration. And you're asking the right questions. We have an awful lot of money we could be putting into defense that we're not doing right now. Let's see how it turns out.
There's also dynamics between the different allied nations within the theater around China. So, there generally is a growing threat in terms of the fact I think China now has the biggest navy in the world. I think they've now superseded as well. And so we see the allies in that area now becoming incredibly concerned. And this pertains to not only Taiwan and South Korea, and of course Japan as well, which is a long-time ally against China in terms of the West, but also in the Australia and the Philippines. Those areas, those specific countries that I want to say are almost within this line of naval attack as well, especially in the agreement. I think I saw a video recently about AUKUS, which is a new contract between Australia, the UK, and the US to supply them with new nuclear submarines in a way to control the strait there, one of the biggest shipping routes in the world. So perhaps the shared responsibility of those nations and the US combined could do more good, could do more universal good than just the US alone. Do you think that's a possibility as well?
One of the things we've seen is winning the Cold War, and for generations, we held the line against the Soviets, and we Sun Tzu said the greatest achievement is to win the war without a battle, and that's what happened in the Cold War. Our great achievement was that they never came across that border, and inevitably the Soviet Union collapsed from within. This is an era of treaties and joint cooperation of large scale. This is not England and all of her colonies versus France and all of their colonies. This is really Churchill in his books, The History of the English-Speaking People, talks about the First World War and the Second World War, were actually what we call the 100 Years War and the 7 Years War and what was the French Indian War in America. That's the first time we saw war across the entire world. But it was Britain and her colonies against France and her colonies, worldwide. It's a different dynamic. We have two nation states, independent nation states, who have stayed together. NATO has been in existence now for well over 50 years, half a century. It's unprecedented in history. So we live in a time in which the potential for treaties to deter a foe is significant. It's been established. It's current in our minds. It is motivating us and guiding us at conscious, unconscious levels. And I think very well, in your list, don't forget Korea or Vietnam, who have already fought a couple of significant spats with China and kicked their tail. And so we've got Vietnam, which is a major force sitting on their border and not having a very positive relationship with China. We've got Thailand, we've got Indonesia, we've got a couple others out there, and of course India. India is enormous potential and is motivated to also as part of that dynamic of restraining China. So the dynamic is there for us to get this treaty and put this string of nations around there and to hold China back. But if we're serious about it, we need to do it economically. The economic boycott of Russia is really what brought them down. We're trading with China. They hold so much of our national debt right now. It would be a win-win if we said, okay, we're not trading with China, and by the way, we're forfeiting all your national debt. We've got a couple of cards to play in this game.
Yeah, I mean, just simply
is one of them.
Yeah, just simply the supply chain crisis that we've seen in the COVID era. I mean, just the pure stranglehold that China holds within the production of so much of the world being caught up in that area again shows the necessity for diversification of supply chains and of resources and of just how we contribute to the world economy as a whole. I mean, and of course, I speak of South Africa hopefully being part of that as well, but we'll see how the future holds in that regard. I want to transition over to just a different topic entirely, which I think you'll have a lot of expertise on. Sorry, do you want to add something?
Well, let's do this. So let's take a minute and address something that I like to talk about. I like to think of myself as a guy who sees things more deeply. And, the book on killing, the resistance to killing, how we had overcome that resistance, it was on, it came out in 1995 and it's several times. It's been on 4 different #1 bestseller on Amazon. But this dynamic that the murder rate is being held down by medical technology. They're lying to us when they tell us a murder rate over any period of time without allowing for medical technology. This worldwide dynamic of suicides exploding and traffic deaths going up and opiate overdoses. And the new factor worldwide is sleep deprivation. And we talked about that last time. We're not putting the pieces together. There's dynamics out there that we don't want to look at. Imagine economists talking about wages and never once mentioning inflation. Well, the entire field of criminal justice, the entire field of criminal science is lying to us when they compare murder rates over any period of time without allowing for medical technology. So we've got this illusion that we're enormously thoughtful and evolved civilization right now, when the truth is really just the opposite. We're one of the most broken, shattered, psychologically disabled civilizations, and in so many ways. We've inflicted pornography on our children at young ages with incredible dynamics unseen in history. We're inflicting violence on our children, but there's a couple of things out there that I just want to mention to you. Going deep and scholarly and talking about the world is a couple of things going on. Number one is the necktie. Fashions come and go. Fashions come and go, but the necktie has been there for over 100 years. And any fashion that men wear, women wear, but women never wear a necktie unless they're in some real demeaning, like a waitress or something. It's always very demeaning. Well, the necktie works because it's a dick. It starts down here, it comes up here, it's got a big knob in the end, and it's just a dick. And 100 years from now, they're all wearing dicks. Can't they see it? Can't they see it? You got the big red power tie on, And I tell my detectives, look, you and your partner go to the front door in your suit with your power tie on. You knock on the door. He opens the door. He doesn't have a dick on. A little monkey brain goes, ooh, ooh, ooh. It really works. But when women wear a dick, the monkey brain goes, huh? It doesn't work. And of course, cowboys, they wear the little string tie. Cowboys say, we're not playing the game, baby. I got my penis compensator right here, baby, on my hip, And the guy that wears the bow tie, guy's wearing the bow tie says, I'm not playing the game. Jimmy Olsen, kind of affirmative. I'm not playing the game until we all put on our tuxedo. And we got all suave and the boner, and we put on our bow tie, and we kind of set all that stuff aside. And if somebody wears a necktie when everybody's wearing a bow tie, it's really weird dynamics. And I'm telling you, 100 years from now, we got our little kids taking pictures with their bow ties, the elders of the church with the little ties. Can't they see it? They're all wearing dicks. Can't they see it? No, they didn't. They didn't see it. And one of the examples I like to use is mowing the lawn. Now, here we are worrying about, the global carbon load and global warming. And what do? The place where it begins is our front yard. So what do? We hammer it with fertilizers. We hammer it with chemicals. So only one species is allowed to survive. And then we cut it off. And how much money is spent on mowing the lawn? How much fuel goes into it? How much pollution is created? How many man hours are wasted? And noise pollution. Why can't we have a meadow in our front yard? Now, and once upon a time, civilization meant cutting down every tree. We would allow one tree to survive in the middle of the field. I suffered this tree to survive, to show my dominion over nature. And I was at West Point, a professor there, right? And I came up through the ranks. I'm not a grad, but they've got this beautiful array of interlocking forts that supported West Point. And I'm looking at this big diorama of these ports. It's a model. And the historian is here. And I said, okay, you left all the trees off so we could see no. There were no trees. They cut them all down. What? Oh yeah, they cut every tree down. Trees were firewood. Trees were material to build furniture. And trees are where the Indians lived. Trees were where the animals lived. Civilization meant cutting down every tree. And then we had Arbor Day in America in the late 1800s. We said, wait a minute, well, trees aren't bad. We need more trees. But this mindset that we had to cut down every tree to dominate the world. And so it's even crazier mowing the lawn. I'm in the process of trying to convert my city would never let me have a meadow in the front lawn. They'd find me and make me mow the lawn. But I'm in the process of converting my lawn to an all clover lawn. Why can't we do that? Why can't part of the White House be all clover? But 100 years, why did they have to beat their lawns into submission? Why do they have to mow it? And it really is kind of back in the days when you had to have slaves with a swing blade was the only way you could have a mowed lawn, and it represented incredible levels of wealth. And currently, it's just one of the dumbest things we could do ecologically, financially, pollution-wise. But so we think we're this arrived civilization, the peak of human And the truth is, we are a busted civilization. We're barely getting by. Preventing thermonuclear holocaust in the Cold War was an incredible achievement. And it's even more incredible when you understand just how broken we are as a civilization at this point in history, and how much we've got to get our act together. And the dynamic, as you've heard me say before, is all this intrusive technology that we haven't digested yet. Kids don't need cell phones. Kids shouldn't be watching TV, and they shouldn't be playing video games. They should be kids. They should have a life. Let adults make those decisions. Don't market these things to children. But just recognize the fact that at the same time we sit here all suave and de boner, right? We're talking about geopolitical dynamics, but at the same time, we're a broken civilization, and we're barely staggering by one leg at a time. And who knows what insanity we'll inflict upon ourselves. And Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. It's the least worst option. It's insane. It'll drive you mad, but it's the best we got. And it's going to have to do. And the meanwhile, we got an insane population driving insane nations. And it's amazing we're able to stay ahead of things. Go ahead, please.
On that note, I know we talked about it last time about the influence of games, and I agree with you. There are definitely certain games that should not be made available to certain age groups. But how do you see we rectify that problem? How do we prevent certain people from playing certain games, especially people that are, for example, younger than 13? Because both Petrus and I can attest to the fact that very easy to circumnavigate age requirements in games. I mean, you just fool the birth date. So how do you see we circumnavigate that?
The same argument applies to regulating children's access to cigarettes or alcohol or automobiles or firearms or sex or drugs. All of those are things we say adults can have, but kids can't. And once it becomes the law, then the parents say, oh, it's the right thing to do. If the ratings were really important, there'd be a law. And so currently, this industry, and again, my book, Assassination Generation, talk about the video game industry fighting the state of California, the home of Hollywood, the home of Silicon Valley, overwhelmingly voted to regulate children's access to violent video games. And the video game industry fought all the way to the Supreme Court to sell any game to any kid at any age. So, that it's an argument we can look at parallels. How easy is it to circumvent the laws about cigarettes? How easy it is for kids to circumvent the laws about alcohol or firearms or automobiles. A kid could drive a car. What's to stop him from driving a car? The reality is that it begins by making it the law. And the law becomes really the best form of education. If we can do it in all these other areas, we can do it here. And when parents know, when it becomes the law, when parents are held accountable, if my kid gets access to a gun, we've got access laws in all states in America that the individual who should have kept that gun locked up will be held accountable. And so, if my kid's, smoking tobacco in the house or getting drunk in the house, and then the family's held accountable for that. So these things are doable. China just passed a law, and of course they can do it, that online gaming for children under 18, 1 hour on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that's all they can do. Now, China will find their teen suicide rates to nosedive, their traffic deaths to nosedive, the opiate overdoses to go down, because all those things are related with sleep deprivation. And the video games are a key factor in that sleep deprivation. And if you don't play them as children, then the whole addictive dynamic becomes different when you're first introduced as adults. It's just like tobacco. If you start smoking at a young age, the addictive dynamic becomes far greater. Let people make those decisions as adults and recognize this as being something that adults can do, but kids can't. And of course, right now, pornography. We're not even pretending to keep pornography away from children on the internet. The accessibility that's there. If we wanted to do it, we could do it. And it's one of those other areas where we've been blindsided by our technology. We had automobiles for 50 years, half a century before somebody said, kids shouldn't be driving these things. Kids can ride a horse, kids can drive a wagon. Why can't kids drive a car? It took 50 years to figure that out. And we're in the process of trying to come to terms, and we've been blindsided with this technology. And in America right now, we've got a whistleblower from Facebook talking about the predatory, the incredible predatory and harmful impact of Facebook on children, and how they're doing that on purpose just to increase their market share. And that's kind of the dynamic in play. It'll take us a while to get around but right now, we got an industry fighting tooth and nail to keep selling their product to children. It all comes back to money, and we're paying a price in a lot of different ways for it.
The scary part,
so
I
anyway,
mean,
it's just a stretch in a different direction, but it really applies. I was just on a podcast this morning about information technology and information operations, IO, and the most comprehensive IO campaign that's ever been waged, every single nation, is movies where the cops are the bad guys and video games where the cops are the bad guys. And this dynamic that the criminals are the heroes and the
GTA
cops are the bad guys is so toxic and so destructive. And it is pervasive in our media today, and we're paying a terrible price for it.
Yeah, and I see it in our research that we do at the university I'm currently at. Is the terminology of screen time is something that is being taught to a lot of parents in terms of how much exposure children should be getting to technology in terms of, especially when they're young. And this is directly contrasted to the profits that we're seeing from these companies, especially in platforms like YouTube, for example, and mobile gaming. So gaming on people's phones, which is very accessible, everybody has one. It's just that they get simply the absolute most money from young children watching hours and hours of YouTube, which are, I mean, there's YouTube Kids now, but let's say it's just to say it's unrestricted is a fair assessment in my mind at the very least. And then, of course, in the same vein with gaming as well. I wanted to ask, especially about gaming, have you recognized in any of the soldiers that you've trained, ever since, gaming has become quite popular and commonplace, the psychology of a soldier or recruit that's coming in to somebody that's been exposed to a lot of war games before they've joined? Is that something you can actually identify within the way that a soldier acts? And do you know how it affects him in combat or the psychology there?
Well, let's kind of back off. When we look at them, one sergeant major deployed to the combat zone. Troops are in a semi-barracks environment, and then combat patrols all day long, life and death combat, but they're back in a barracks environment. And the sergeant major said it was lights out 10 o'clock every night. And he said, if I see you playing a video game, we're going to take your video game. He said, within a week, I had a closet overflowing with video games. He said, these are good troops. They wouldn't disobey an order, but they can't not play those games. And when we see a unit deployed to a true field environment for a year with no electricity, no power plugs, no Game Boy, suicides are non-existent. Sleep deprivation, PTSD dynamics go way down. This whole idea that we bring our toxic culture with us. So this, I thought that one sergeant major was so representative of this culture. I think without a doubt, that we saw the movies and we played the video games and a slice, we fought this war without a draft. All of these people in this war volunteered. And I think without a doubt, the video games and the movies, there's this thing in us that I want to see what it's really going to be like. And just like the kids playing Grand Theft Auto say, I want to see what it's really going to be like too. And we see that happening. But as far as how it manifests itself, I'll give you an angle on this. We are using essentially video game simulators intensely to train our troops for combat. These are hyper realistic. We'll put them in a vehicle. They're in an up armored Humvee with a turret mounted weapon and firing ports, and they're in a vehicle, and the driver is driving, and the vehicle turns, and we can't simulate G forces, but we can simulate turns, and they're in this comprehensive video game, and we know that it is absolutely essential to get our firing rates and our hit rates and our performance up for combat. Just like flight simulators are used extensively. And of course, the holy grail is simulator fidelity, simulator realism. So if we see it being used extensively in the military to enable them for combat, it's a reasonable assumption that it's also going to do it with them. Now, as far as inappropriate violence, as far as inappropriate, other than sleep deprivation, which is rampant, I cannot show you any place where the video game generation became the slaughter generation, the massacre generation. We've truly fought a war for 20 years with only one real major atrocity. We had a staff sergeant in Iraq commit a mass murder. It's just unheard of to have, multiple nations fighting a war for 2 decades with really only one real atrocity you can really put your finger on. It's pretty astounding. So I'll tell you that the military is pretty good at putting their stamp on things and getting their control on violence. And the simulators are very restrained. If you shoot at the wrong time, you shoot at the wrong direction, there's great sanctions that are brought down upon you. And before they get in combat, they're very well trained. But the dynamics of the simulator being able to train people for combat, I think, are very realistic, and is a legitimate question. When we're using this technology for our military, we're using this technology for our cops, then we turn around and sell it to the kids and claim it's harmless. You can have it one way or the other. You can't have both ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a psychological effect with both going, there's an appropriate age restriction on these, and controlling these is incredibly important in the way that it's played forward, because you can't simply give the same things that you give to soldiers to kids. That's not going to be the correct time for them to absorb that type of information, especially if they're not ever going to go into the army. But I also thought, maybe in a scenario,
imagine how we would restrain Donald right there is appropriately cynical about how are you going to restrict these things? How are you going to stop them? But they said the same thing about tobacco. They said the same thing about alcohol. They said the same thing about automobiles. If we don't have a model fresh in our mind of how to do it, it looks impossible. But it's doable, and I think we're going to have to do it to come out the other end of this society and of these crazy times. But I'm sorry, you were saying, please.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that I agree with you that there should be, but I would just say that it should be more of a PR campaign, because I would just say it's very easy to fool the online system as opposed to buying tobacco where you have to present an ID. So I think mainly it has to be focused around a PR campaign where you tell people, or write books like you are doing, that there should be balance. That's mainly what it's about.
And there is, with alcohol, to this day, we have a PR campaign about, ID them before they sell it. Tobacco, to this day, we have PR campaigns about the harmful effect of tobacco. On every pack of tobacco, we've got a warning. So the PR campaign, without a doubt, has always been part of the solution. And you're quite right. It can't be just, boom, making it a law and thinking it's going to happen. Without that necessary PR campaign, of course, the people who are invested in selling this stuff to children also happen to have control of our information networks in so many ways, and bringing them under control is going to be quite a battle that lies before us.
Yeah, it's going to be a slow and steady. The sustainable change is going to be a cultural one, where information is being brought up with books and PR details and all those things. But I just want to say, because we're coming up on an hour, so thank you so much for talking. I don't want to give Donald the last chance. Is there anything else you wanted to ask before we end this off?
No, it's fine. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Dave.
It's my pleasure, guys.
And Lieutenant Colonel, do you want to add something?
When this one's coming up, I'll put it out on my social media. Believe in who you are. Believe in what you're doing. You're really making an impact above and beyond what the average college student or the average individual is doing out there. Keep rocking on and believe in who you are. You are breaking the barrier of information. You and the good people listening to you are one of those hopes for our future out there. So God bless, and thanks for having me on.
We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate it. I mean, it's always so insightful bringing these perspectives going and making, asking the questions, even if we can't get the answers out there right now, but asking the questions starts the discussion. And those discussions, especially when it's happened enough people, are the point at which we get a lot of change happening. So that's what we're trying to do. So we really appreciate it and feel honored that you recognize us as well. And for those of you that watched it, this is exactly what we're trying to do. If you were to share this video with people around, not of course, would it perhaps change their perspectives, get them thinking about this important stuff, but obviously, it'll help us out as a YouTube channel as well in terms of the mission that we're trying to complete here. So thank you so much for, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman for talking to us, Donald for joining us. Just, thanks for watching until now. So this has been WorldView. Goodbye.